Hello everybody, what is going on? My name is Steggy, and in this video, I'm going to share with you what I believe to be the 3 best lenses you can get for streaming. If this video helps you out, be sure to hit that like button as it does help with YouTube's search algorithm, and consider subscribing if you like videos about content creation, gear, tutorials, and more. And as always, all products discussed in this video will be linked in the description panel down below. Now they are affiliate links, which means that if you do happen to purchase anything through these links, I receive a small commission, which does help support this channel, and at the same time doesn't cost you anything extra. So if you choose to do this, just know that I appreciate you. Now, I made a video 2 years back on the subject of camera lenses, and in it, I go into quite a bit of a deep dive into camera lens basics, like explaining focal length and aperture and their effect on ISO and everything like that. But in the interest of time, I won't be doing that again for this video, but I will have the previous video linked in the description panel below if you'd like to go back and learn some of the basics. Now, before we get into camera lenses, as a preface to explain how this video will go, number 1, we're going to be talking about crop sensor cameras, as these are the most common for stream cameras. If you'd like me to make a video talking specifically about full frame options, let me know in the comments section down below because I'm curious to see if there's any interest there. Number 2, the specific models of lenses I'm going to be demoing are for Sony APS-C mirrorless cameras. However, later on, I will be showing the closest comparable lenses you can get for Canon DSLRs, Canon Mirrorless cameras, and Micro Four Thirds cameras like Panasonic. Number 3, I will be showing full frame equivalent values for all lenses discussed in this video. This is incredibly important if you have one of the other brands of cameras because their different sensor sizes can affect the field of view a lens can give. AKA, if you have an identical lens, it's going to have a different field of view and background blur performance between Sony, Canon, and Panasonic. I'll explain this more later on. But think of it like reduced fractions. The full frame equivalence is the best way to show the common denominator between all of these types of sensor sizes and lenses. Number 4, the last thing to consider with these lenses is not only does sensor size affect the lens's field of view, but if your camera is 4K capable, it may add an additional magnification or crop to your picture. AKA, if you want your camera to be in 4K because you want the high resolution, it might be a little bit more zoomed in. For example, with Sony cameras, if you're shooting in 4K 30, on most of them, you'll have a 1.2 times magnification or crop, compared to if you were in 4K 24 FPS or 1080p 60 FPS. For the Sony cameras, I'll be showing the difference between 4K 30 and 1080p 60 field of views, but keep in mind that the magnification strength varies between camera brand and model and what resolutions and frame rates trigger this. So I'm not going to be able to demo every permutation of this in this video, but if you're only going to be doing 1080p, then this is something you can kind of disregard. And if you are looking to shoot in 4K, just reference your camera's manual or look it up online to see what the additional crop is. But just pay attention to the little labels I put in the video clips that denote the resolution and frame rate and if there's added crop as a result. Because most of this video will be in 4K 30 because I like my YouTube videos in 4K. And to show the differences between the crop and no crop, it's cleaner to mix 30 FPS footage with 60 FPS footage than it is to upscale 24 FPS footage to a 30 FPS timeline or the other way around. And lastly, this list is not in any order. There is no gold, silver, and bronze medal here. These lenses each serve different types of purposes, but are the best lenses for those purposes, which I'll be covering during the demo. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first, I wanted to start off with the obvious lens. Now, this was crowned the king of lenses in my last video, and this is the Sigma 16mm f1.4, which you're seeing right now. Movie magic, am I right? So what's so awesome about this lens? Well, number 1, the 16mm focal length, which is a 24mm full frame equivalence, offers a really nice wide field of view. This is a really great focal length if you're looking to capture a wide stream in your streaming setup with your camera mounted on the back of your desk, like the classic webcam positioning. So right now where I'm sitting, I'm outputting 4K from my Sony a6100, and the camera's lens is about 28 inches away from where I'm sitting right now. And this is how much of my room you're actually seeing. So now if I take this same point of view and switch it to the 1080p mode, you can see it's even wider. So now if you have a camera that can do both 4K and 1080p like the Sony a6100, you can see firsthand how wide the images you can get from this lens. The second reason why this lens is so great is because of that f1.4 aperture. This is a really nice wide aperture that will allow you to get that blurry background behind you. Now this is also going to let in plenty of light, so it's going to give your camera much better low light performance. For example, this is how I'd look with this camera with just my monitor and my laptop as my light sources. This camera lets in so much light that I can still be properly exposed without the image looking all grainy. Just keep in mind that if your main source of light is coming from your monitors, then it can sort of vary wildly depending on what's displaying on your monitors. AKA, if you have varying colors and brightness, like from a video game playing on your monitor, then this is going to cast on your face a lot more than if you were to have a proper stream light. Lastly, the Sigma 16mm f1.4 is great because of its price. In the US, you can get it for a little under $400. Now, I've seen this regularly go on sale for around $370. That's actually the price that it's currently at the time of recording of this video, and I've seen it go as low as $320. And just getting this kind of quality and sharpness and getting that aperture and focal length for this price is pretty hard to beat. There's literally like no competition for this lens right now from other camera lens manufacturers. This is just a remarkable little lens. So this lens is awesome if you're looking to mount your camera in the classic webcam position to get that sort of classic webcam field of view, but also giving you the best sharpness and most amount of background blur you can get for this field of view. However, the next lens on my list will give you even more of a blurred background, and it's actually cheaper than the Sigma 16mm f1.4, and that is the Sigma 30mm f1.4. So what's the catch with this lens? Well, as you can see, this lens is just way too zoomed in for that classic webcam position. So even when you switch your camera off of 4K 30 in order to remove that extra crop, you can notice that there's still a really narrow field of view with this lens when you use it in the classic webcam position. So if this lens isn't viable in the classic webcam position, then why is it on my list? Well, with proper camera placement, it looks amazing. So right now, this is the same f1.4 aperture as the Sigma 16mm, but that background blur is a lot stronger because of that longer focal length of the 30mm. And just for your reference, this is the field of view of the same angle without the additional 4K crop. And also for your reference, here's both the 4K and 1080p field of views of the Sigma 16mm lens in the same position. So in my last video, I covered a similar lens, the Sony 35mm f1.8. So you might be wondering why I suggest this Sigma over that Sony 35. Well, the biggest reason is price. The Sigma 30mm f1.4 sells for about $270. Meanwhile, the Sony 35mm sells for over $200 more at about $470 at the time of this recording. So what are the differences between these two lenses? Well, with the Sony, you'll have a slightly more zoomed in picture because of that 35mm focal length. As far as aperture goes, the Sigma 30mm will have better low light performance because of that f1.4 aperture versus the Sony's 1.8. However, the background blur performance should actually be a bit equal because even though Sony's aperture is a little bit smaller, that extra focal length should make up for it. So I would consider those pretty much equal. So the big difference between these two lenses is the Sony 35mm has image stabilization. However, this feature isn't really useful if you're using this lens for a stream camera purpose because your camera is going to be locked off on a tripod or a multi-mount, so you're not going to actually use that image stabilization. That feature is really useful for people who want to do handheld filming or low light photography. So unless you are planning to use your lens for that, that's kind of a moot feature that you're paying over $200 to get. So in this situation, I would recommend the Sigma because it is over $200 cheaper and it'll actually get you that better low light performance. So the Sigma has a lot better value in my opinion. So between the two lenses, I would recommend saving the money and getting the Sigma versus the Sony. So if you're looking for a unique camera angle for your stream and aren't opposed to having your camera a little farther back, then the Sigma 30mm f1.4 lens can be an amazing companion to your camera. With this lens, you can get a super sharp subject and a super blurry background. I really love this lens and especially how affordable it is. But what if you want to show a little bit more of your streaming setup? Or what if you want a lens that has a little bit more versatility so you can get different fields of view? Well, this brings me to the third lens on my list, which is actually brand new, and that is the Tamron 11 to 20mm f2.8. So let's switch over to this lens. Now we're shooting with the Tamron 11 to 20mm, which is actually what I was shooting the intro to this video with. Now, this is a zoom lens, which means that you can change the focal length to change your field of view. So while the first two lenses I showed are prime lenses, which means they just have the one focal length, this is going to give you a lot more options. So you can be zoomed all the way out like I am right now at 11mm, which is known as an ultra wide focal length because of how wide the field of view is. And you could zoom all the way in, if it'll let me, to 20mm. So the full frame equivalence of this is 16mm to 30mm. And again, this is in 4K mode. So this is how this same zoom lens looks if you were in 1080p 60fps or 4K 24fps on your Sony camera. So it's pretty nuts. And since this is an 11 to 20mm for focal length, this means that you can actually set this lens to 16mm and get the same field of view as the Sigma 16mm lens if you wanted. But then you have the option of zooming in a bit more when you want the camera focused more on your head and shoulders, or you can zoom it out if you wanted to show more of your setup. You can get some really great looking shots with this lens in a lot of situations. So this of course works in the classic webcam position, whether you're in 4K or 1080p, giving you the options for ultra wide to regular wide field of views. The side angle field of view also works well for this lens. It has a completely different look than the Sigma 30mm lens. This is actually a really great lens if you want to get that Harris Heller kind of look. Now, he uses a full frame camera with a 14mm f2.8 manual focus lens, and then he letterboxes his camera in to get the cinematic aspect ratio for his streams. So this is about 16mm full frame equivalence to his 14mm lens, but has that same aperture and then also has autofocus, so you're always going to be sharp, which is great. And I know earlier I said that there is no gold medal winner in this video, but I'm honestly loving using this lens. I'm just super happy I added it to my collection. And for my setup, it might just have to be my main stream cam lens, where previously it was the Sigma 16mm f1.4. Now, this doesn't offer quite as much background blur as the 16mm lens, but it still has some good background blur, and I honestly love being able to go wider with this lens. And this lens has the added benefit of being a great type of lens for vlogging. So if you plan on using your stream camera as a YouTube camera as well for things such as vlogging, then this can be a nice versatile lens for that as well. But all of this goodness comes at a price. The 11 to 20mm sells for $830, which is considerably more than the other two options. So this is definitely the premium option versus the other two. And if your aim is just to get the most background blur as possible, then the other two options are going to be the ticket for you. Now, back to this lens though. If you saw my last video on lenses, you might remember seeing me cover another ultra wide lens on there, the Sony 10 to 18mm. And you might be wondering why I choose this lens over that. Well, this lens has an aperture of f2.8 versus Sony's f4, so it will have better low light performance and have more background blur. Now the trade-off is this lens doesn't have image stabilization where the Sony one does. But again, this isn't really necessary when you're locked off on a tripod or a multi-mount for streaming. However, if you are looking for a dual use of this lens for things like vlogging, then this feature might seem like a bigger deal to you. Except I would say that when you're dealing with as wide of a focal length as this lens, the image stabilization isn't super necessary. Camera shake from hand holding is more prevalent the more zoomed in a lens is. So for a lens this wide, the lack of stabilization shouldn't actually be much of an issue. So if it comes down between the two ultra wides when they're both very similar prices, I personally recommend the Tamron because I think that added benefit of the f2.8 outweighs the image stabilization of the Sony version. And those are the three best lenses for Sony cameras for streaming. But what if you use Canon or a Micro Four Thirds camera? Well, let's talk about the most comparable lenses for them. So again, you're not going to always find exactly one-to-one the same lens for a lot of these, but I'll go over the comparable lenses and the differences. So first off, Canon DSLRs. For a look like the Sigma 16mm lens, we have the 14mm f2.8 Rokinon lens, the lens I actually mentioned earlier that Harris Heller uses. Now, this will have background blur more similar to the Tamron 11 to 20, and this is a manual focus lens, but it will give you a similar field of view and close to the bokeh performance as the Sigma. And thankfully it is a bit cheaper too at $330. Now, for the 30mm lens, While it is a bit more expensive, there is actually a 30mm f1.4 Sigma lens for Canon. So the thing to keep in mind here is that, number one, it is more expensive at $470, and it will also just be a hair more zoomed in than the Sigma for the Sony, because Canon's APS-C sensor has a 1.6 times crop factor versus Sony's 1.5 times crop factor. So your image will be 6% more zoomed in on the Canon, even though it's the same focal length for the lens, as I was trying to explain earlier. And lastly, for the ultra-wide zoom, I've got two options for you. The first is the Canon 10-18 f4.5 to 5.6 lens. This is actually a really affordable lens for getting this ultra-wide field of view, but keep in mind that it's got a stop-down aperture, so you're not really going to get the same background blur like you'd get with a 2.8 lens, and the low-light performance won't be as good. And the aperture also isn't constant, so the aperture is actually going to stop down even more to that f5.6 once you start zooming in that lens. However, this lens does have image stabilization, which being able to offer that for a lens that's less than $300 is a nice little benefit. Now, there is a Tokina lens that is a little bit closer to the Tamron for ultra-wides, but that lens has an audible autofocus motor, which I wouldn't recommend for video or streaming because I don't know if your mic would pick up the noise if it's that loud. But if you look up YouTube videos where you see the autofocus performance of that lens, it's definitely audible, so I think you might. So if you've got a Canon DSLR, the Canon ultra-wide is a pretty awesome and really affordable option. But what if you've got one of the newer Canon mirrorless cameras? Well, like Canon's DSLR cameras, Canon's mirrorless sensor has a crop factor of 1.6 compared to Sony's 1.5. So again, just keep in mind that your field of view will just be zoomed in about 6% between Sony and Canon cameras if you're using the same exact lens. But luckily, the Sigma 30mm and 16mm lenses are both available in the Canon EFM mount. So you can get the exact lenses I discussed and demoed for your Canon mirrorless camera and expect almost identical performance to the Sony. But for the ultra-wide, there unfortunately isn't a 2.8 lens like the Tamron for Canon EFM. So the most comparable option for you would be the Canon 11-22mm f4 to 5.6. It's $400, so it's much cheaper than the Sony and Tamron ultra-wide lenses, but it will have a decrease in low-light performance, and it won't have that background blur of the Tamron lens because of that smaller aperture. But this is still a great option if you have lights in your streaming setup and will work great for vlogging as well. And finally, what if you're using a micro four thirds camera like a Panasonic? Well, this is where sensor size matters more because not only are you going to see a decrease in background blur because of the smaller sensor size of a micro four thirds or MFT sensor, but the crop factor on an MFT sensor compared to full frame is 2 times versus Sony's 1.5 times. So basically, if you have the same exact lens on an MFT camera that you do on a Sony, you're going to be zoomed in 33% more on that MFT camera. So with that out of the way, let's start with lens number 1, the Sigma 16mm f1.4. Now, you can actually get this exact lens for your micro four thirds camera, and it's about the same price as the one for Sony. But because of what I discussed earlier, because of the sensor size, it's going to be zoomed in about 33% more. Now, not to scare you too much, because on my Sony, the crop factor from shooting in 4K 30 is 1.2 times the normal field of view. AKA, it's 20% more zoomed in than if I were shooting in 1080p mode or 4K and 24 FPS. And honestly, I've been really happy using this lens while shooting in 4K 30, so the micro four thirds crop will be just a little bit more zoomed in than that. Now, if you really wanted that 24mm full frame equivalent field of view like you get on the Sigma 16mm for Sony, you could get the Panasonic Leica 12mm f1.4 lens for your MFT camera, but this lens is $1,300 versus the $400 for the Sigma 16mm, so I would lean towards the Sigma in this case and just deal with the extra zoom. Moving on, we have the Panasonic 25mm f1.7 lens. This is going to be the closest alternative to the Sigma 30mm f1.4 on the Sony. Now, it is going to be a bit more zoomed in because it's got a full frame equivalence of 50mm versus the Sigma's 45mm full frame equivalence. And it's going to have a little less depth of field or background blur than the Sigma because of the smaller aperture, and of course the smaller micro four thirds sensor. But the awesome part is how affordable this lens is at only $150, so this is an amazing value lens. And lastly, if you're looking for an ultra wide zoom for your Micro Four Thirds camera, the most comparable option is the 8 to 18mm f2.8 to f4, which goes for about $1,000. So this is pretty close to the Tamron 11 to 20mm option, except for one key difference. And that's that this lens doesn't have a constant aperture, which means that if you're zoomed all the way out, you're gonna get that f2.8 aperture like the Tamron, but if you zoom in on this lens, it stops the aperture down all the way to f4 when you're zoomed in all the way at the 18mm end. However, this lens will give you the ultra wide field of view that you want. So that covers the 3 best lenses you can get for live streaming, as well as the comparable lenses if you're on a non-Sony lens system. Now, if you don't already have a camera and happen to be shopping for one, be sure to check out my video on the best cameras for live streaming. Now, if you couldn't guess based on the demos in this video, I do recommend Sony the most, and this video will answer why. Now, if you have any questions or suggestions for any topics on cameras or other content creation gear you'd like to see me cover, be sure to leave a comment down below. And again, make sure you hit that like button and get subscribed so you can catch more of my videos. Once again, my name is Steggy, and until my next video, I will catch you guys later.